All right, 7th graders, so we're going to look at Chapter 1, Lesson 3, on our properties of numbers. So hopefully these should be a little bit of a review from last year, but maybe it will be a good refresher. The property that we're going to look at is our commutative property. And if our commutative property, if we remember correctly, it tells us that the order does not matter. And our commutative property works for addition and multiplication. It does not work for subtraction or division. Remember, in those two operations, the order matters. So our examples would be that if I had 5 plus 3, that is the same thing as 3 plus 5. Or multiplication, if I have 2 times 7, that's the same thing as 7 times 2. Sometimes we see it written as A plus B equals B plus A, or A times B equals B times A. Now, one thing that the commutative property sometimes people get confused on is when we see parentheses, sometimes it's still commutative. So if I have 7 plus 2 plus 3 in parentheses, my commutative property could still work with this to show me that if this is A and this is B, that I can switch them. 2 plus 3 plus 7. And that's showing the commutative property. Our next property, which is the associative property. Now, the associative property states that the groups can be changed. All right, the groups can be changed. So it usually has to do with parentheses. And it also works for addition and multiplication. Again, not for subtraction, not for division. So the associative property is telling me that if I take 5 plus 2, that they're associated with each other, and then I want to add a 10 to it, that's the same thing. I'm going to keep the same order if I take 5 plus, and then in parentheses 2 plus 10. So here is what I would normally be doing, is I would be doing the 5 plus 2 first. Here I would do the 2 plus 10. We can see that 7 plus 10 is 17, and 12 plus 5 is also 17. This also is true for multiplication. So A times B times C equals A times B times C in parentheses. So it doesn't matter the order, all right? If we use our variables to show us in addition, we have A plus B in parentheses plus C is going to equal B plus C in parentheses and plus A. Okay, that's our associative property. Our next property is the additive identity. Remember, identity is telling us about himself. He wants to stay the same. So our additive identity property is something that we can add to a number that he stays the same. And what that is we can add 0. So it states that if we add 0 to any number, it stays the same. All right, so an example would be is if I had 5, I added 0, and I still have 5. Right? It can also work the other way. 0 plus 5 equals 5. And again, we can show that by saying A plus 0 equals A. So anything that I add 0 to stays the same. Our next property is multiplicative identity. Again, identity, we want him to stay the same. So it states that any number multiplied by 1 stays the same. And we can show this by showing that 6 times 1 still equals 6, or 1 times 6 also equals 6. And we can show that by A times 1 equals A, or 1 times A equals A. And our last property that we're going to learn is our multiplicative property of 0. And what that says is that any number multiplied by 0 equals 0. So we can show that by saying that 2 times 0 equals 0, or 0 times 2 equals 0. And again, we can show that a times 0 equals 0, or 0 times a equals 0. Be sure you try these problems down on the bottom of your paper, but don't do the ones for in class.